Thank you, Donna, and to Music Worship Arts. The town had called for a volunteer to represent us, in case of disaster. And you can imagine who I called. And Donna said, not a problem. And when she came back, she said, well, she knew most of those things that they tried to teach her. Still, we're very grateful. Let us prepare ourselves for the Word of God as it comes to us in the reading of Holy Scripture. Our reading today comes from the fourth Gospel of John, the 9th chapter, selected portions. Here begins our reading. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's work might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam." Then he sent and washed, and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I've told you already, and you would not listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Here ends our reading. These are holy words. Thanks be to God. I recall that I was 16 and with my friends at a basketball game and looking at the scoreboard. When I realized, see the numbers. They were blurred, and I wasn't sure if our team was winning or not. And so the next day off I went with my mother to the optometrist or the ophthalmologist, and there began a long period of my having to wear glasses for distance. Well, then, only a few years ago, I went to see the ophthalmologist, and I learned that I didn't need glasses for distance at all, but I did need them for reading. And so here I am wearing them. And throughout that period of having to correct my eyesight, I never for once thought that it might be a punishment, a sin, or that it was my parents, who had passed on that condition to me, perhaps, except by DNA. But I never felt that there was some kind of a spiritual darkness that was the cause of this. Well, in the Gospel of John, we have a different idea. In fact, the Gospel dwells on evil and sin, if you notice. No wonder, perhaps, it's the choice for Lent, when we're reflecting on our shortcomings, trying to give up bad habits, or doing something useful for those most in need and different from ourselves. The odd part, however, is that our passage from chapter 9 stops at verse 41. For actually, the story continues after this, and it ends in the next chapter, if you're reading ahead, which we will hear during the Easter season. It's the typical style of John. First, a problem is described, then a sign or a miracle is provided, and after that, dialogue with and commentary from Jesus, which explains the meaning of the sign. John 9 tells us about how Jesus comes to meet a blind man. Immediately we learn his disciple ask, who sinned? Was it the blind man or his parents that caused this poor man to be born blind? And later in the story, the blind man whose sight has been given to him as a sign is brought before the Pharisees and asked, how could Jesus have performed such a miracle? For not only was this sort of thing unheard of until now, but it took place on the Sabbath. Imagine that. And no one's supposed to work on such a day. In other words, why did Jesus sin? Even later in the story, the blind man is brought back to the Pharisees yet again, and this time he's asked if because he believes in and defends Jesus, if he himself sins. It is here that he is expelled from the synagogue. Finally, at the end, the Pharisees ask Jesus what is their condition, thinking they are beyond reproach, but Jesus declares that they are sinners. The message is clear. Those who appear to be without sin or who think they are without sin better think again. Those in the community who don't recognize the blind man after he's healed better wonder why not. Those, like the blind man's parents, who pull away from their son after he is miraculously changed should be warned. And those like the Pharisees, who are sighted, in good health, well-educated, and well-off, better reconsider just why they seem to show such poor judgment. For it is understood God sees through everyone's conditions and comes to understand everyone. This, obviously, is not a simple story about blindness and sightedness, but one about spiritual blindness and religious clarity, insight, and understanding. 2 weeks ago, Nicodemus came out furtively at night, you remember, to meet Jesus, returned home and hid in the shadows. And last week, for those of you who discussed the lection at breakfast, the Samaritan woman at the well came out in the midday sun, talked with Jesus, and began to understand more. Today, we have a story about a blind man, and out of childhood darkness, he comes as an adult to have mud, or as our Lenten reading group would say, dirt, applied to his eyes so that he can see the light, and through Jesus gets to better understand the nature of the true light of God. His was a slow unfolding from his own reality of not seeing with his eyes to amazing grace, profound hearing with his ears, understanding with his heart, and seeing anew with his eyes. In the Old and New Testament, this concern for sin has been prevalent, with the assigning of its responsibility often a preoccupation. Notice that either the blind man himself or his parents were blamed by Pharisees for his condition. Was it something that he did before birth to cause his disability? Or was it something such as a poor diet or lack of attention from his parents? Or was it because he insisted on becoming a disciple of Christ, thereby removing him from his well-known community? Or was it the religious authorities who failed to grasp what real seeing is all about? In the present, we're still grappling with sin and blame right in our culture. Why the deaths in the trenches of Europe in World War I? Why Hitler's death camps, including the deaths of Seventh-day Adventists and Gypsies? Why the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the city with the greatest number of Christians in Japan? Why those lost in the killing fields of Cambodia, the disappeared on the plazas of El Salvador, and those killed in genocidal fighting between the Hutu and the Tutsis in Rwanda? And now, as we sit here, it was just confirmed, the collateral bombings on civilians in West Mosul in Iraq. Helen Keller in the 20th century summed it up, I think, when she said, "My darkness has been filled with the light of intelligence, and behold, the out-daylight world was stumbling and groping in social blindness." Here was someone who could not physically see, but who could comprehend, analyze, and understand deeply the spiritual darkness of our world. Years ago, I learned that the family that composed the Westboro Baptist Church of Kansas, which is homophobic and makes it their mission to travel around the country protesting non-heterosexuals, and also at funerals, was going to appear yet again. They were going to protest at the memorial for the chaplain of Harvard University, then the Reverend Dr. Peter Gomes, a friend, who had come out sometime during his long and distinguished ministry. Thankfully, it was the Patriot Guard Riders, as they called themselves, who made it their counter mission to block the Westboro Baptist Church from doing any damage, made it known that they would be present. And along with students and faculty and community members, they saw what was wrong, and they stood witness with compassion and justice, and not much happened on the edges on that day. And then this past week, after a month-long string of violence, as you have been reading, against Jewish institutions in the United States, a teenager was found to be responsible for many of the threats and was captured by police in Israel. The 18-year-old suspect had dual Israeli and U.S. citizenship. Over 100 threats had been sent to synagogues, their community centers, schools, museums, even an airline, and particularly to the Hasidic Lubavitch communities. These coincided with the increase in hate crimes in our nation over the past several months, from scrawled swastikas to the vandalizing of Jewish cemeteries to homicides on the basis of religious belief. The issue here is, did he do it because he did not want his tradition to change, or because they, particularly the Hasidic Lubavitchers, have not and will not change? When I hear today's reading from John, it seems to me that it was written for these fundamentalist, hate-filled members from the Westboro Baptist Church of Kansas and this misguided Jewish teenager, suspect from Ashkelon, Israel. The harm that they have done and the smear that they have added to any who want to describe themselves as religious is deeply troubling. Don't they see what they have done? To them, I believe Jesus says, "You say that you see, but you are blind, and your sin disgusts us all." Extremism in religion, be it Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, is dangerous, wearing, and meant to be stood up to. To paraphrase one theologian, David Tracy, who did so much of his work in the area of pluralism at the end of the last century and the beginning of this, he said, "The world is changing so rapidly, and theology with it. Religious extremism, which advocates no change and oftentimes exaggerates nostalgia of the past, is the human reaction to the inability to make sense of and to dialogue with the movements of modernism and postmodernism, which was set free in the 60s. We need to look for moderate and thoughtful movements such as ours and those in different traditions with which to collaborate. This is the growing edge. We need to be that growing edge, not extremists, not even thoughtless denominational, because some denominations contain some extremist wings. But the working together with diverse interfaith groups like United Action or even Start Fresh to make for a more compassionate and just world, to heal blindness. Today's story of the blind man assigns sin to those who fail to see goodness set before them, become paralyzed, and act out in a hateful and destructive way towards others. Who among us hold blind spots towards our own sinfulness and needs for healing? Toward what real concerns of our neighbors do we find ourselves turning a blind eye? Instead, let us, like the blind man whose sight was restored, give honest and generous thanks for God's healing hand in each and every one of our lives here. Let us claim the green pastures, the still waters, the touch of oil, and the cup that does indeed run over for us, and for all of God's people. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, is here with us, leading us, inviting us to come, be fed, and be healed. May this be so. Amen.